Okay, let's dive into this thing. Waiting for the tea to cool down, but I should be okay. No, can't see it. Today we're talking about faction turn stuff. I have been. Hey, Aaron, good to see you. Been messing with faction turn stuff, and if you've followed me for any period of time, you know that I've been messing with faction turn stuff for a long time. Haven't ever made anything that got out there with faction turn stuff, but I have two projects, generally speaking, this year that are going to be faction turn stuff. So I kind of had this moment while I was working on New Dawn stuff earlier, kind of thinking I have an idea of how I want to do the faction stuff. And it's a little different than what I kind of mentioned at the end of yesterday's stream, where I talked about units and stuff. I think we're going to put a pin in that units thing, and that might come back in a future expansion and or the Nova board game. Oh, cool. I'm glad you think New Dawn is shaping up pretty cool so far. I'm pretty happy with how it's going. I'm happy with this map building stuff. Obviously, I want to update it ever since talking about, doing the stream yesterday. I want more starting sectors. In fact, I want to double the starting sectors. Generally want those sectors to be a little bit more dense in terms of points of interest. And then mechanically, some of the stuff like theme and points of interest, where I was talking about specifying the faction that's there or the resources there, that stuff's going to change based off of the new faction turn stuff that I'm going to talk about today. So a lot of this resource stuff I'm not going to probably include in New Dawn. That might show up in my future plans, which I'll talk about. But I kind of want to rein it in. So if you're watching this and you watched the first part of the New Dawn playtest and you're like, okay, I think I know what he's doing, I've already changed my mind. I'm pretty happy with how New Dawn is shaping up so far. I think it'll be a cool supplement for Nova. So from a faction turn perspective, here's kind of where here's the conclusions that I came to today. I was trying to think about okay, so what does a unit look like, right? So to give you some context, I have now at the bottom of this doc my unused or scrapped ideas, and I had these ideas about what a unit in a faction would be, like its health, its harm, costs in terms of resources, how it's deployed, a sector effect and a mission effect. And I was looking at all this stuff, and I tried to make one for Corvus, and it's doable. It's just, I think, a lot more than I want it to be. When I think about faction turns, there's a few that come to mind. One is the Stars Without Number faction turn, which, if you've seen Stars Without Numbers faction turn, it's very involved for the GM. There's economics involved. So you're generating credits, essentially resources that you're using to spend on units, and these units are moving around to the different planets in your sector. And it's like a whole game on itself that the GM plays by themselves between sessions. It's pretty cool, but I think it maybe goes beyond the scope of what I want to do with Nova. I think that concept of creating the units and moving them around is something that I want to do, but I've always wanted to do that with the players, with the full group, rather than the GM doing this by themselves. So I think I'm going to take a lot of these concepts that I've talked about with units and things like that and shift that away to either one of two things, possibly both things. One, an expansion that comes out later that adds these units to the faction turn stuff, or entirely as its own game, just a separate thing, just a fun Nova board game. And this is inspired by previous playtests of previous versions of the faction turn, where we had people coming together, they played the factions and they played against each other, and there was this cognitive dissonance that existed because I was constantly telling everybody, you're not trying to win this, remember, this is just a thing that supplements the world, but it's players against each other, and it looks like a board game, and you want to win a board game. It looks like a dudes on the map board game, right? And so there's a bit of cognitive dissonance that exists in that. So I think that just should be its own game, separate from all of this. So I've been thinking about it. So I'm just kind of scrapping this unit idea for now, possibly saving this as a totally different thing, and instead thinking about, what do I want the faction turn to be? And I've kind of came to some conclusions that since the mapping for New Dawn is this point crawl thing, right? It's this, like, it's these maps that have nebulous sectors that are connected to each other. It's not like it's a hex crawl or like a hex map that has like specific distances and things like that. It's difficult to think about units holding spaces and moving spaces on something like this, and it just feels like, given that this is what the map looks like and how the players are interacting with the map, it feels more abstract, right? It feels more narrative, and as a result, the faction turn, I feel like, should feel more abstract, more narrative. So I wanted to kind of step away from the unit stuff with that kind of premise in mind. So I'm not looking to do what Stars Without Numbers is doing. I think Stars Without Number is a fantastic game. The faction turn is unbelievably fun and cool. I just don't think that's what I want this to be. That's why I think it'd be better as a board game. The important thing that I've noted to myself is, remember, Spencer, this is a tool. It's a tool for the Nova RPG. It doesn't have to be a game unto itself. I even had a document that I created January of last year that I didn't really look back on until this morning, where I talked about doing a more narrative or abstract approach to the faction turn, where thinking about things as zones and factions that just do things that are abstracted out, like leaving traps or affecting the city, or building outposts, but as like more abstract ideas, rather than, this is a Corvus Hawk unit that has 3 health, you have to wear it down with the other factions or take it out as sparks or something like that. But it was more abstracted out, and I like that idea quite a bit. I also then feel like this allows me to lean into the asymmetry stuff that I love so much, right? We can get some like more narrative vibes of Root, essentially. I've already disagreed with myself on this, where resources are important. I think resources are not going to be important. So I went on like a mini tangent here. So I had initially kind of planned New Dawn to be this faction turn with enemy units moving around, but then also the players are moving these units around. That stuff's going to come later, I think. I think generally speaking, my new plan is to make a base, a solid, simple base for a narrative abstract faction turn that could be added onto through the future expansions. And we've talked a lot about this stuff in previous things, and I think this is just the track that I want to follow now. So the base faction turn in New Dawn won't have any player stuff. The players aren't doing anything in the faction turn. It's purely a GM tool. Future stuff will allow the players to start interacting with the faction turn with like the nest system that we talked about a long time ago with the keywords. And each of these is going to add what I'm calling a frame. I don't know if I'm actually going to call them frames, with these like robots or teams that you send out from the city. So like the scouting frames. This is going to allow you to map the dusk in a way that you couldn't before. And base building gets added when we add resources with the Haze Dweller stuff. And like, actually, I don't know about this units thing though. I'm still kind of back and forth on that. But here's kind of my like broad idea about what I want to do with the faction turn now. I want the factions to do this sort of stuff, and it's going to be based off of an influence score. So if you're familiar with Light, I don't have my copy. I don't know where a copy is. But in Light, there's a campaign mode in it called Control, and that in that The factions are abstractly represented by just like a score, essentially, their influence on that planet. And it doesn't really do a whole lot other than like add some tables that you might roll in when generating missions. Influence score is going to do a lot more because the factions are going to use this as almost like a credit limit on what they can do. But it's going to be based off of these abstracted scores rather than units moving around that can do things. So basically, what I think a faction can do during the faction turn is something like this. Where's my... Okay, I should talk a little bit more about the influence score before I talk about what you can do. Here's how I generally think I want to do it. A faction has like a total influence score. So let's say, for example, the Corvus have an influence of 5 right now. They can spread that score out however they want across the map, as long as it sums up to 5 or less, I guess. So that means they could have all 5 influence on one sector and just be really powerful there and have no influence anywhere else. They could have 1 influence in 5 different sectors, be very spread out, weak in all of the sectors, but they can at least do something in them, or something in between, right? And this is what the GM is deciding on their own, right? This is the GM's game, is thinking about how the stuff moves around. And that stuff gets changed as other factions attack each other abstractly, just decreasing scores. Sparks completing missions in sectors, going to decrease the influence of a faction in that place. And then it can also be increased. In fact, it's going to be increased 2 ways. One, a faction can use their entire turn to just bolster themselves and just increase their total score. Also, every turn, every round of the faction turn, which happens between each mission, all of the factions increase their total influence by 1, which means the factions are consistently getting more powerful. They're also getting decreased because they're fighting each other and the sparks are going out on missions. But it also means that if you're not attending to a faction, like if you're just not going out to sectors where the lunar cults are and like taking care of them, their influence is going to just keep rising unless the other factions keep them in check. And so eventually you're going to have a cult problem because this influence score is going to allow them to do bigger and more badass abstract narrative things in the game. So that's kind of like the concept of the influence score. Like I said, it's kind of like a credit limit, like how much the faction can spend to do cool things. And so let's talk about what spending cool and doing cool things is. So like on your turn as a faction, what you can do is you can reinforce, increase your total influence. You can leave a keyword at a sector. And I think basically factions are going to have lots of keywords. Like, for example, the Corvus might leave traps or something like that. Right? They could leave traps that affects like travel through the sector or missions there. Or the Hellions might leave like a garrison keyword or an outpost keyword. That means there's like a large troop presence or you have to fight more when you go through this place, right? So there will be certain keywords that the factions can leave on the map that you, the players, will have to deal with when you get to those locations. If you're looking at that keyword and thinking, that sounds kind of familiar, it harkens back to the nest stuff we had talked about with the Corvus expansion, where eventually the players will get this nest, this system for mapping the dusk that will allow them to detect keywords ahead of time, maybe even cancel out keywords so that they can like undo traps before they even show up. So the keywords are there to create a small effect of some kind that the faction has left in that sector. They can change the theme. They can, oh wait, no, I should go back down here. Yes. They can expand. They can move to another sector, right? They can expand their influence to another sector. They can do things to points of interest. So we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about points of interest. You can do 3 things to them. You can destroy one, right? So if you have a certain degree of influence, you can just straight up destroy a point of influence. Yet I have to think a little bit about why they would do that. There must be something that they gain from doing that. And I'm not sure what it is yet. But I think this is important that they can remove points of interest from the map. This is also more difficult if an enemy faction occupies that point of interest. They can build them. I think each faction will have their own small list of points of interest that they can build that cost or require certain amounts of influence. None of them are actually going to be spending their influence. It's just it's a threshold, right? You have to have this much influence in the sector in order to lay claim to it, to put a base there, for example. So, you know, the Corvus might lay down a research station or something like that, where they're testing out their weird stuff. Or the Lunar Cult might put down a ritual pit, right? And that does something, right? It's now a point of interest that the players can interact with when they go to that sector. It's a point of interest that the GM can use as a location for a mission. And it does something. And it can be destroyed, right? It can be destroyed by the Sparks and or other factions. Or they can occupy it. They could just kind of like lay claim to it, which I think like the generic points of interest might do something if a faction occupies it. It modifies it in some way. I haven't exactly figured out what it is, but I think these are generally what the factions can do at a sector, is that they can influence the points of interest by destroying them, adding more things, or just kind of like attaching themselves to them. And that's going to be like between this and the keyword stuff, that's going to be like the primary influence of the factions during faction turn stuff, right? They're warping the effects of they're warping the effects of the sectors by leaving their factions stuff, and then they're also messing with the points of interest that are there. I think they could also probably change the theme. I think it requires a great degree of influence, but I do like the idea of like a faction being able to take something from being like I feel like the Lunar Cult would want places to be pale, right? And so they might want to change a radiant location to a pale theme. That would be beneficial to them as a faction. Because I think maybe that increases their overall influence score if the number of pale locations there are. So that's a big thing that they can do. And then they can attack each other. They can just reduce the influence score of another enemy faction. I can't tell if they have to be in the same sector. It kind of makes sense to me that they have to be in the same sector as opposed to like neighboring sectors, but maybe some factions can affect neighboring sectors and others can't. I don't know. I feel like maybe the attack action, now that I'm thinking about it, like might be resolved differently for each faction in some degree. Like I feel like the Hellions being the Hellions should probably be really effective at attacking. Compared to like the Lunar Cult, which they're not really big on attacking, but I feel like when they decide to make a move against an enemy faction, it should be like influential because they're doing their weird moon magic. So that's kind of the general premise. It's this abstracted out influence score that the GM is using to kind of spend across the existing sectors. And to kind of go back to our map here, right? If our starting map looks something like this, right? It has like, this has 7 segments, right? So if our starting map has like 4, 5, 6 segments, something like that, the factions are going to be spread out across those segments. They're going to have small amounts of influence at first, and then they're going to just try to build up and mess with these things consistently. I don't think there's necessarily a goal that they're trying to accomplish. I don't know. I haven't thought too much about the concept of like a goal and what does it look like for a faction to like accomplish that goal. That was something that I did in previous versions of the faction turn, where if there was a goal that they wanted to accomplish, and if they did that, they got like access to more powerful stuff. Maybe doing something like that. But I don't know. I'm not sold on that because again, there's no winning the faction turn. The point of the faction turn is purely for the world to feel alive, for the sparks to feel like they have an influence on the world, because they will be doing things in sectors and it will be changing what the factions can do. And the factions will be doing in sectors, and that will change what the sparks can do during their campaign. And then ideally, in the future, I can release those faction specific, like enemy faction specific expansions, like the Corvus being the first one. It adds that keyword thing, like the nest, and so the players can start like mapping out the sections, learning what's going on out there, negating these keywords. Base building shows up in like the Haze Dweller one, right? So resources become a thing. The factions themselves maybe don't use resources too much, but they're trying to deny the sparks the resources, and stuff like that. And it adds the player side component where they're sending out squads that aren't the sparks between missions to go do stuff in the dusk. This is the direction that I've kind of landed on for the faction turn. I feel pretty good moving in this direction. Just because as I was really trying to think about the units thing and everything, I was really struggling because it just, you know, the scope of the projects kept getting bigger and bigger in terms of how I was going to try and pull this off. And there was just so many interconnected pieces between the sector generation and the mission generation, and now the faction term with the units, and it just was a lot. And so I wanted to kind of rein it in a little bit. I think I've rated it in a direction that makes sense, that I'm happy with. Hopefully it makes sense and people are going to be happy with it as well. So I thought I would kind of like mess around with this stuff and see generally what it would look like or feel like to make some of this stuff for our factions. So like, what can the Corvus Dominion do when they are influencing the world? If the factions are able to consistently enact tangible changes to the world, a distinct objective probably isn't necessary. It can come up to the GM for what specifically the cult's rituals are for. Yeah, I agree, Aaron. Right? I don't think they necessarily need a hard and fast goal or a progress clock tracking, whatever it is that they were trying to do. I think it's okay for them just to be consistently messing with things. And that's interesting enough on its own. And you as the GM can kind of with your table, paint the picture of what that looks like, how that's influencing your campaign over play, and stuff like that. Rather than saying like, sorry, the Corvus finished their clock and something bad has happened as a result. It's kind of how I feel. That's how I'm thinking about it, at least right now. So, going back up to this stuff, right? So I need to think about actions that they can do. So reinforce, I think this is just like everybody can reinforce. Again, I think maybe this could be a little asymmetry opportunity. Like maybe the way that factions reinforce is different based off of who they are. Same thing with expanding, right? So I think reinforcing, expand, and attack might be different depending on the factions. And then we've got the keywords that they can leave and the points of interest actions. Change theme. Yeah, okay, so that's everything. So, yeah, I don't know. Today is just brainstorming some of these concepts and what it might look like for the Corvus to expand on the map and do stuff. I don't know. For now, I'm just going to say increase total influence +1. Maybe it's something that they can do it, you know, at start of round. Others might do it differently. Like maybe the Hellions increase their total influence +1 for each blank, right? For each blank, something that happens. So the Hellions increase their influence based off of having deployed stuff, as opposed to the Corvus, who are just consistently getting stronger, or something like that. Maybe an idea is for each distinct sector they have influence in. That feels extremely strong. That's so strong. But I have to, that might seem strong, but also these total influences, yes, they're going up at the start of every round, but they're also going to be going down each round as the factions attack each other, and like as the sparks wipe out the factions in sectors. So like the Corvus might have suddenly a huge surge where they have a ton of influence, but then like the other factions can just put them in their place by wiping them out, right? Just a concerned, like a concentrated effort of the Hellions to be like, oh, actually the Corvus are too strong. We're going to spend our entire turn attacking Corvus. And that's all we're going to do. I have to think about like how many of these things you can do during a turn. Like what does a turn look like? Is it an action, number of actions thing? I don't know. Maybe each of these has a certain action point cost or something like that. So you could do X number of things, 3 actions. Maybe something like that. Just a note that I feel like Hellions should be really good at this. Can do it more effectively than other factions. So maybe like the attack action by base default is designed to only let you choose one faction in one sector to reduce, but the Hellions can do multiple times or something like that. I feel like can expand to sectors that they aren't adjacent to. Feels right for the Corvus. They can fly around, right? They're very good at that sort of stuff. I'm thinking the Haze Dwellers might just naturally expand. Like they might just every turn they start with just like they get a free expansion every turn. Something like that. I should be doing this for each of the factions instead of just Corvus and Hellions. Lunar Cult. Oops. Ugh. These ones. Then you could also like get real fun with this eventually. Like these are the 4 key factions, but like eventually you could add more, right? Like you could add another faction to the game. Whole new enemy faction. Some folks have already done that, right? Like in Nova third-party stuff, where there's new factions that have been added and so like you could think about how you might translate some of those into the faction turn, and ideally there's sort of like a structure in place through like a creator kit or something that tells you like what do you need in order to make a faction in the faction turn if you wanted to go beyond just the standard 4, right? Oops. So I feel like they should just like get a free expand every round. Just feels good. Yeah, exactly, right? Aaron, break out the Prophetic Hive. That would be so cool to think about what they look like in regards to this, right? And a whole new weird faction that's messing with all this stuff. And because it's being demonstrated through these abstract actions that they can take and influence scores, it's not like you have to come up with a whole bunch of different units for it and all these rules about like, does this unit feel fair or balanced or anything like that. it's cool to just add that faction and just give them some cool things that they can do. Attack, I don't know. Like I said, I feel like the Hellion should be really good at it. Probably not very good at this, but when they do it, it is a big deal. Makes sense to me for the Lunar Cult. I don't see the Lunar Cult being the faction that's just attacking all the time. I see them doing weird keywords and stuff. And then those keywords allowing them to mess with people instead of something else. Change theme. I don't really have anything to say about that right now. So in terms of, before we go into keywords, again, the point of interest actions right now are build, destroy, and occupy. And I don't know, I don't know how faction specific this, destroy is. I think that's just a thing that factions can do. Maybe the influence threshold is different between them. And I feel like occupying a point of interest doesn't depend on the faction. It depends on the point of interest, maybe. Right? So this would be something that I would add to the points of interest instead. What is this? So if a faction has occupied this industrial ruin, it does this, right? It provides this to that faction. That doesn't feel like a faction specific thing. Not faction specific. Not faction specific. Maybe the influence threshold is it. Aaron says, I was already planning to add some faction turn rules to the Hive way back in the original board game iteration. Might be fun to check out those notes and adapt them. Yeah, that would be cool. That'd be very cool. And then when I make the board game, you can use those board game notes as well. Because I do want to do that. I still kind of, just to take a tangent here, I still want to do the board game thing. I think I want to make basically my own version of Root with the Nova factions vying for control and having an element where there is the Sparks doing stuff and it's like an enemy AI deck or something that just messes with the map, and you all are still doing your very weird asymmetric stuff as the factions, but just straight up making it a board game feels fun to me, rather than trying to figure out how to translate that into a faction turn that influences the RPG. The build, though, this is the specific one to each of the factions. So, the Corvus should be able to build certain things. I feel like they should be able to build some sort of, spy tower or something like that, right? Spy tower, something that allows them to track other things, get the jump on others. Feels like a cool thing that they can build, right? And then I don't know. I don't want to call it a nest, but their base, right? All of them should be able to build a base of some kind. And a base is, bases can just generally give certain advantages, right? So I feel like to kind of go into this. I feel like the base for the Hellions makes it harder to reduce influence from attack actions, right? So it's harder for other factions to eliminate the Hellions in a sector if they have a base there, right? That feels appropriate, right? The Hellions are the most war-like of all the factions. They're the most like an army. And so they would have outposts and bases and things like that that would reinforce their positions wherever they decide to occupy in the dusk. So I think that's kind of generally what the base looks like for our aliens. For the lunar cults, definitely want like them to be able to make a ritual pit or something like that, right? It just feels good. And I don't want to make too much stuff. I don't want this to feel super overwhelming for the GM. This is something that this is their free fun that they do between sessions, and so they're not doing it at the table. They're not doing this in a way that's very time sensitive where everybody's watching them to see how it's going. You get to do this at your leisure, but I also don't want it to feel super overwhelming. But I like the idea of like a ritual site, right? Maybe this links up with keywords. So the LC are trying to get certain words down and then activate them at a ritual site. Something like that. That could be kind of interesting. And then again, they'll have like a base. I feel like a base for them is just something about like increasing influence. Just feels like that's what they should be doing. A Haze Dweller base is going to be something dangerous, I feel like. I mean, Haze Dwellers, they're the beasts of the dusk. So, I don't know. A base for them is interesting. Also, what would they be able to build? Like, what does it mean for the beasts of the dusk to create a point of interest, right? Now, I'm thinking already that I might change this, where I have a landmark that is a predator layer. I feel like this becomes what they can build. And I just create a new landmark, right? Because this feels so linked up with the Haze Dwellers compared to like everything else isn't really linked to a faction. That I feel like they can create a predator layer or a hunting ground, something like that. Feels kind of cool. Just really good at killing factions when this is present, right? So if they can get a hunting ground down, then they become highly effective at eliminating influence of other factions in that place because you're on their territory. They're hunting you now. And they can just start wiping you out. Maybe this might be the thing that activates that free expand thing mentioned above. This is the place they expand from. Maybe. All right, so they build a base somewhere. It's like a breeding ground, essentially, right? It's like a breeding ground. And they just start making Haze Dwellers and start spitting those nasty beasts all over the place. I feel like, I mean, I guess they can occupy places. Yeah, the Haze Dwellers can occupy places. They can live inside. Sure, they can live inside the landmarks. Would they live inside the strongholds? I think so. I think they'd hang out there. I'm wondering, thinking this out loud, just thinking this out loud. I've got like the keyword thing, and then I've got like occupy here. I'm wondering if I could combine these. Right? Like, when you occupy a point of interest, you tag it with a keyword. That's what it is. As opposed to just, like, generically putting a keyword across an entire sector. To say that the entire sector is filled with traps feels weird now that I say it out loud. But occupying this cave system and filling it with traps makes a lot more sense. So I think I kind of like that. I think, nope. And I gotta like bold it and green it so that I go back and or highlight it so I change it. I think this is where the keyword stuff comes in. Laying a keyword down across a whole sector feels weird. Feels big, like what a theme would do. But tagging a point of interest with a keyword totally makes sense. I think that makes more sense. I like that a lot better. So we get rid of this concept of keywords, and now Occupy very much is faction specific, and it is the set of keywords tagging points of interest. That's what it means to occupy something. I like that. I like that a lot more. That feels good. Somehow I have... no, things are fine. Yeah, I like that. I think that's good. So, what kind of keywords do we think? And these again are like, they're kind of narrative, they're kind of abstract, but they should have some sort of mechanical influence. At a macro level and a micro level, I think, is ideal. So that, or maybe one or the other. They don't have to necessarily affect both, right? So note on keywords. First things first, linked to the Occupy POI action. These can have either a macro or micro effect, maybe both, but that would be expensive. Meaning you would need to have a lot of influence to do that. So these are things that, so for example, traps, right? If the Corvus have traps, this would be something that probably is more of a micro thing. Yeah, is a micro thing. I think this, and like this would automatically have the keyword attached to it, right? So I don't know. I don't know what it is. It could be a macro thing too, I suppose. Anybody moving through the, but no, it's a point of interest, right? So I guess that's the other thing I was kind of thinking about, is I did think the keywords would be able to affect macro stuff, and if it's at a point of interest, it's not always going to affect other macro level things, but I'll figure it out. Yeah, I don't know, micro thing. Just shit ton of traps during missions, right? They're just really dangerous now. While maybe a Hellions thing is like a garrison, and this, I don't know, it makes attack action more effective, something like that, right? So they've created a garrison, and as a result they're better at attacking people because they've taken over this point of interest and this is where they're sitting. Haze Dweller, point of interest tags, right? And then Lunar Cult stuff. Okay, this feels pretty good. I feel like this feels pretty good. I have to get into like now coming up with the nitty gritty for all of this stuff, but I feel like generally speaking, this is in a good place, like a decent place, where like I can imagine, kind of putting this back up on the screen here. I can imagine as a GM having fun kind of tracking these sectors and adding new sectors from time to time. That's, you know, something that'll get added in and will become, I think, maybe further reinforced with future stuff. But like tracking the presence of these factions in these sectors and how they're moving around and the weird things that they're leaving for each other and for the sparks. I think that could be pretty fun. And then every week, or you know, however often you play Nova, you go on a mission based off of the mission generation stuff from New Dawn, and then you as the GM go through the steps, move the factions around, have them do things, and now the world has changed next time the players play. And then they go out and figure out how it's changed when they go out on missions. Seems cool to me. Awesome. I feel like that's a good stream. I feel like it's a good stopping point, because now I'm going to get into like writing specific stuff, but I got the bones down. I'm feeling pretty good about that. I'm going to try and get as much of this done today as I can, because I'm going to be leaving for my honeymoon very soon, and I'm not working on anything during the honeymoon, so I'm going to try and get this done while I've got it fresh in my head, so I can kind of hit early next year with a lot of New Dawn stuff. Thanks so much for hanging out, watching the stream, or, you know, watching it later on as a VOD. Appreciate you. Hope you enjoyed this. I'm getting real excited about it. Hope you are too. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of the day, morning, afternoon, evening, wherever it is you are. I'll see you later. Bye.